Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack, and today we're discussing The Crucible.
The Crucible is the famous play by Arthur Miller, the American playwright. It premiered on January 10th, 1953, and Arthur Miller had previously won a Pulitzer Prize for his other famous play, Death of a Salesman, and he went on in 1956 to marry Marilyn Monroe.
It is a dramatized and largely fictionalized story of the Salem witch trials. And it came out of the same era that we got the book The Devil in Massachusetts from Marion Starkey, 1949, that possibly influenced his inspiration and creativity.
Yes, he came across that book happily at the time when he was ready to write this new play. And the other thing that it ties in with is the second Red Scare in America, known for McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. And he directly wrote The Crucible in response to one of his friends being called to testify and to name names. And after that happened to his friend, he drove to Salem and started his research and got into all this witch trial history that he used to shape the story, even though, as you said, it is dramatized, it's fictionalized, but it's a very important allegory for injustice and witch hunting in general, going after people, labeling them as other based on some flimsy suspicions, that kind of thing.
Outcasting who you perceive as traitors.
Yes, very much so. Anyone you see as a threat to your existence, the existence of your community or country, we're supposed to not give in to fear and allow panic to happen. And then these excesses and injustices happen in these investigations, like the McCarthy hearings and the HUAC hearings.
So the Crucible example is as important as it ever was. And I want to point out, I believe he only had to drive over from Connecticut. Am I right?
That's right. He was visiting his friend in Connecticut, and then he just popped over to Salem.
Those two, they really always seem to connect somehow.
Somehow, Connecticut witch trials, Salem witch trials. There's links there and commonalities, of course.
We're going to jump into the McCarthy trials a little bit more in this conversation. And it is important to have a grasp of that history so you can see the allegorical meaning. Like the witch trials, the McCarthy trials are made up of individuals and their stories of accusations and injustices.
So the Crucible has been seen extensively in live theater. There's been multiple film and television adaptations. It's also satirized in several other newer plays about the Salem witch trials, such as Witches in Salem. And it's evaluated in John Proctor is the Villain. And we have episodes of The Thing About Witch Hunts about both of those. One is coming up and the other we've already done. So go check it out.
And I personally got to see a high school production of Witches in Salem.
Speaking of high school, many people know about the Salem witch trials through reading The Crucible in high school English or literature classes and performing it in their theater class or drama club. So a lot of people get exposed to it. That's probably why the Salem witch trials are so well known in this country and even abroad. The Crucible runs, in large theaters in London at times.
It's on the stage right now in a Georgia high school. Oh, wait, it's not on that stage now.
Oh, yeah. Fannin County High School in Fannin County, Georgia, north of Atlanta. I guess some of the adults in the community felt that the Crucible is a bit demonic, which, having watched it a number of times and read it, I wholeheartedly disagree. I think it's a very important lesson for everybody. We've talked on this podcast a number of times about how we need to draw lessons from the witch trials and apply them today. And the Crucible is really a helpful tool in learning, what fear does to people and how these investigations and injustices can happen when people enter a panic or a frenzy of fear.
It's in the news if you want to know more about how things are going for the Crucible in Fannin County.
Yes. Which I find that it's happening in a small North Georgia town. Very interesting, because one of the plays that we've recently discussed on the thing about witch hunts, John Proctor is the villain. We talked about that with Professor Jane Barnett. And the playwright there, Kimberly Bellflower, is from a small town in North Georgia. And so the play is set in what's identified as a one stoplight town in North Georgia. And Fannin County has very light population density.
You hate to see censorship of something that's already saturated our culture and just to sour the experience for the drama students and the community. And I hope that things improve there.
Indeed. Now, a lot of historians will talk about the inaccuracies in the Crucible, but before we get to what's different between the Crucible and Salem, I want to talk about what's actually the same. And one of the things that I find to be very good and true about the Crucible, or at least it rings true, is the whole spirit of the witch hunt is really captured in the play and the films, and the emotions of the events and the individuals involved are really encapsulated well in this drama.
The magistrate Danforth, who is representing all of our magistrates from 1692-93 in one embodiment, has a great quote. Quote, "The devil will not rule over 1 single inch of Massachusetts." And that encapsulates the existential threat that was feared.
Yes, it's true, as appears in the writings of Cotton Mather, that there was a panic about the devil conquering the church and the state in the New England colonies. Another thing I find very accurate about the Crucible is the reasons that are given for accusations. You see very clearly dramatized cause and effect. So and so gets mad at neighbors for animals eating up her food and says, you all go to the devil. And that's interpreted as a curse. So she's arrested. Just all these different accusations that are shown in the Crucible have some basis in real accusations from 1692.
Crowded courts. We know from lots of great records and literature and nonfiction how crowded the space was where they were examining the alleged witches, how crowded the spaces were where the afflicted girls were being afflicted. The courts were full of commotion and noise, and there was all these personalities clashing. I mean, it was just chaos. A lot of like what we see in the Crucible.
Yeah, from the first examination right through the last trial, the afflicted people were present in court as they are in the Crucible and making all kinds of noise, fainting, getting pricked by pins, they say, all these different things happening, these fits that are used as some of the evidence against the alleged witches. This, what is happening in the courtroom, is actually what the accused end up being indicted for. They're not indicted for anything that happens before they get arrested. They're indicted for what happens during their examination in the meeting house in Salem Village, in the townhouse in Salem, sometimes in a tavern. These examinations were held in various locations, but they were always crowded and always full of this noise.
One of my favorite scenes that it is in the Crucible and it's also in the newer play, which is in Salem, and pretty much right out of the examinations is the spectral attacks and images in the examination, like in the court. So you've got the evil birds. You've got when they turn on Mary Warren and they see her specter. Like I feel like that really helps capture the high intensity of what the afflictions were doing and, just thinking about those accused persons sitting there, you know, having this happen around them and they're to be blamed for it.
Yeah. And the Mary Warren, I'm so glad you brought Mary Warren up, because the Crucible is historically accurate to a degree in the portrayal of Mary Warren. She did work for the Proctors, and early on, she was an afflicted person, but then she changed her mind temporarily. And when she changed her mind and said that the accusers, the afflicted persons, were making up these things about the specters that happened in both real life and the Crucible, the afflicted people turned on her and she got accused, and she actually got arrested in real life and thrown in jail for a little while until she switched sides again and worked for the afflicted, accusing other people. So we've discussed a lot of the similarities between the Crucible and the real life Salem witch trials. Now we want to talk a little bit about what's different. One thing that clearly stands out when you watch the Crucible is that the timetable is all shifted and it's compressed. So things happen a lot quicker. And this is basically just for story purposes. You're telling this in a 2-hour period, trying to condense the whole Salem witch trials. So of course they've got to, cut out most of the days that happen and make it all fit. Another really fundamental difference between the real Salem witch trials and the Crucible, it comes down to the confessions. In the Crucible, confessing saves your life. In reality, we know that people who confessed were condemned to die, and Chief Justice William Stoughton signed death warrants for them to die on or about February 1st, 1693. But they survived because Governor William Phipps issued a last-minute reprieve. So it's basically, that governor pardoning or granting clemency to the death row inmate at the last minute.
Yeah,
Kind of
so
thing.
it's not our opinion that confessions didn't save their lives. It's literally in how it played out. Because there is some books and articles, and people do often still convey the story with these confessions saving lives, but that is a strictly Crucible element. It isn't from the real story.
That's very true. And one last thing I'd like to point out on the confessions is that Samuel Wardwell confessed to witchcraft. He did recant at the last minute, and then they hanged him. So one person who confessed was actually executed. It didn't save his life to have confessed. And we know that these other individuals were condemned to die and they had confessed.
In the Crucible, the story begins with a very particular problem and cause for afflictions. In real life, we don't know why the girls were afflicted or behaved as if they were bewitched. We do know that it was not ergot poisoning because girls with afflictions was a very common component to witch hunts before Salem in other communities. So that's just one little reason you can cross off the ergot poisoning. But it doesn't matter that much to understand why these witch hunts weren't okay. Instead, we must understand why adults went along with what the afflicted said.
Yes, that's very important. We need to know why the accusations were actually leveled against the people they were leveled against, and understanding the reasoning, the mindset of the individual adults who entered complaints, gave testimony. That's important to understanding why the witch hunt actually happened the way that it did and why this full panic happened. As we talked about, the beginning of the Crucible is different than the beginning of the suspicions of witchcraft in Salem Village in 1692. In the Crucible, the girls are bewitched because minister Samuel Parris finds them dancing in the woods around a kettle or cauldron, and there's something boiling in there. And he believes that magic is being done, that Tituba in particular is teaching some form of voodoo magic to the children. And we know that is nowhere in the record that Tituba ever practiced any form of magic other than the English witchcraft that she followed at the behest of Mary Sibley in late February of 1692 when she baked the witch cake. There is, though, in Tituba's confession, I'll use that term loosely, she confessed it seemed to have been forced out of her one way or another, coerced or through violence, possibly. But when she confessed, she said that she had learned magic from her previous mistress in her previous country, which was Barbados. But that would have been an English woman who was her mistress down there. And so any magic that she was involved in was under the instruction of English people, and it was English folk magic.
There's a little bit to clear up about the Putnams. Anne Putnam Sr. was not left with one child named Ruth. She had many children. She had experienced a recent pregnancy loss. We do know that. But there wasn't a Ruth that was in the midst of the afflictions. It was Anne Putnam Jr.
Yes. Anne Putnam Jr. is one of the most well-known of the afflicted people. She was involved in dozens of accusations. But we do know her mother did not lose 7 children before the age of 1. We also know that another afflicted girl, Abigail Williams, didn't work for the Proctors and certainly didn't have an affair with John Proctor. In reality, Abigail was the 11-year-old niece of the minister Samuel Parris, and she lived and worked in his household. And John Proctor was a man of about 60. The play and the film, they're very different in their portrayal of Abigail and John.
Yeah.
Who, as far as we know, had no real contact at all. There's no reason for them to have contact.
I do think in the Crucible with that dynamic, it was really key to the personal struggle that he was going through. Arthur Miller, I mean, he built the story around that affair. So you take that out, it's a very different play.
Yeah. Then you're left wondering, why are they accusing? In the play, Thomas Putnam gets accused of making land grabs. We know that land grabs didn't happen in reality. People didn't make an accusation and then somehow buy up their neighbor's land. We do know that land disputes, boundary line disputes, that is, were entered into some of the testimony. That was why people were angry with each other and might have been a factor in some accusations. But land grabs, no. So, Sarah, why are we still fascinated with the Crucible?
Well, I'm fascinated because my great, great, great ninth great grandmother is a character in it, though that's not the only reason I'm fascinated. But why are we? Because my Google alerts almost every day, I have some type of social media or blog or book that's being published or some news report that is mentioning the Crucible. And the productions are all around us.
Yes. Every day we get we get these alerts about different witchcraft topics, and the Crucible is one of those. And it's so often performed that just about daily we get some announcement that it's being performed at this high school or this college or this community theater. There's evidence that we're still fascinated with this
Yeah.
story. And I think part of the fascination is that there is actual witchcraft in the Crucible, where we don't know about any actual witchcraft happening in the Salem witch trials. It just didn't happen. They weren't guilty of anything they were accused of, afflicting people, covenanting with the devil. That was just not happening. Uh,
Yeah, we recently did an episode over on the thing about Salem, about the Salem puppets. And they were used in the courtroom to egg on the afflictions of the girls. But evidence wise, you couldn't, there's nothing showing that those puppets had any power.
yeah, exactly. And the whole scene with Tituba doing the magic with the girls, Abigail Williams drinking the blood, that all that stuff is so sensational and astounding that people find that very entertaining. And it's unfortunately become a bit of the lore about Tituba, but it is a reason that people are compelled to like the Crucible.
The afflictions are dramatic and scary. And the truth is, with the witch trial history, afflictions are dramatic and scary.
Yeah, and this is where the allegory works, even though it's not based on the reality, because confessions of guilt didn't buy you innocence or get you off the hook for witchcraft. So, but in the Crucible, a confession of guilt, you get forgiven and you do not hang. So you either confess or you hang. And that's similar to in the Red Scare, these committees doing these investigations put a lot of pressure on people to confess to communism and working for the Soviet Union. And they were pressured to name names in exchange for lenience.
And that happens in investigations today. A crime happens, an alleged suspect, you know, is sitting, we've all seen the videos, sitting at the table, and there's that pressure, confess, get it off your chest. Tell us you did it. Tell us, why you did it. And I think, as, culture, we're still looking for justice. And do we find justice because we hear a confession, even if it isn't an authentic answer to what's happened?
Yeah, that's such a good point. Confessions are still today coerced, or they're taken under some form of pressure upon the suspect. And we know that false confessions do happen, and people go to jail for things that they didn't do based on this confession, because a confession is and was the gold standard of evidence to convict somebody. If they themselves tell the jury and the judge that they have done this crime, why not believe them? And it's easy to not conclude the investigation and consider other evidence that might exonerate them.
Arthur Miller deserved a second Pulitzer for John Proctor's confession, especially if you are enthralled in the story and really, let it take you to this chaos and this struggle. And then when John is pressured to confess, I just find that confession so moving.
It's the climax of the play. It's so compelling and dramatic. There's so much tension there and conflict, inner conflict within John Proctor and the conflict within the community. It's highly compelling and engaging, edge of your seat kind of theater. And what he says when he confesses, then they say, oh, we're going to hang this confession on the door of the church for everybody to see. And he says, no, you can't do that because it'll ruin my name. And you're going to, I'm confessing this stuff. Isn't that enough that I confess to you, but leave me my name? They ask him, why is he tearing up the confession? And he goes, because it is my name, because I cannot have another in my life, because I lie and sign myself to lies, because I am not worth the dust on the feet of them that hang. How may I live without my name? I have given you my soul. Leave me my name.
Thank you, Josh. That's so powerful. And I hope it makes people think about why descendants are so, not all, but a lot of descendants are so passionate about having the names cleared of those who are accused of witchcraft. Because as John, his name was everything. That really, really is and was the case for these individuals, and the tarnished name that they forever had from these experiences were this powerful, this damaging.
That's such a good point, because if you were even accused, even if your case didn't go to trial and you were never convicted of anything, just the accusation hung on to you as a person and ruined your name for basically the rest of your life. Your name was no good in the community because of a witchcraft accusation. We see this not just with Salem, but all witch trials, that anybody who survives, their body survives, but their name dies. And that's what John was so afraid of, that his name was going to die when he gave in this confession.
There's another quote from the story that I find very meaningful and exceptionally relevant to today, which also John Proctor is quoted as saying from the play: "Vengeance is walking Salem. We are only what we always were in Salem." And I really feel like that same statement can be said today. We are only what we always were as humanity. Witch hunts are still happening weekly across the globe in different cultures, and across time, they've continued to happen. And that's happening because we're still hunting traitors. We feel betrayed sometimes by our loved ones or our neighbors. And when that involves the fear of a curse due to many of the same things that we see in history, sickness of children, crop failure, you name it, it goes back to this, that we always that we are only what we always have been. And that's why we still are seeing innocent people accused of witchcraft crimes that they're not committing.
And we continue to label people, to categorize them as the other, as the enemy, as the unknown. And we fear the unknown. We fear change. So new things, different ideas easily get categorized as other and set aside. And we find ways to deprive people, once we label them as other, we demonize them, and we deprive them of their humanity and their human rights. And we see this happening around the world all the time in so many different ways. Everybody can point to some kind of witch hunt that they've seen in the media or maybe experienced for themselves. So we've mentioned that the Crucible is an allegory for the Red Scare. Indeed, it's the second Red Scare that it's an allegory for. There was a first Red Scare in America at the end of World War I. This was largely in response to the Bolsheviks overthrowing the Tsar in Russia and implementing the communist system of the Soviet Union. And there was widespread fear around the world, but especially in the United States, which was becoming a superpower at the end of World War I. We'll have more about these Red Scares in future episodes. I just want to summarize a little bit about this second Red Scare, which is also known as McCarthyism or the McCarthy era. And really, it started before McCarthy became prominent. And in 1947, President Harry Truman signed an executive order that required that all federal civil service employees were screened for loyalty. Loyalty meant that they were not members in or had any affiliation with any organization that the Attorney General termed to be totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive. Or if they were advocating, or their organization that they were associated with advocated for the denial of constitutional rights by other persons, or they sought to alter the form of government by unconstitutional means. So all government employees for many years were required to go through these loyalty tests. There was a loyalty board that reviewed cases, and thousands of government employees lost their jobs because of this.
Joseph R. McCarthy. Let's talk about February 9th, 1950. He was sent to West Virginia to give a Lincoln Day speech to the Republican Women's Club in Wheeling. What he said that day became very shocking to the nation. He claimed to have a list of members of the Communist Party USA working in the State Department. How scary and frightening. He attracted substantial press attention for that, and the term McCarthyism was born. We've mentioned the investigations that were happening in Washington during this era. In Congress, the primary bodies that investigated the communist activities were the HUAC, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Between 1949 and 1954, a total of 109 investigations were carried out by these and other committees.
Yeah, and HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or formerly known as the House Committee on Un-American Activities. It's confusing. They gave it different initials than the way it spells out. I know. But that committee was actually born in 1938 and existed until 1969 when it became the House Committee on Internal Security. And then that survived until 1975, still doing investigations into subversives, alleged subversive people in the country in various capacities. HUAC is infamous for bringing in a lot of people from Hollywood and the entertainment industry in general. But they also looked at government officials and just prominent citizens.
And when you watch these hearings, which are really, there's lots of access to them on YouTube or wherever have you, you can imagine what some of these alleged witches were also experiencing. These alleged communists were not given an opportunity to defend themselves. They were answering yes and no questions that were packed with complicated facts. When Rebecca Nurse and any of the other accused were sitting there, they weren't actually given the opportunity to defend themselves with answers to the magistrate's questions.
That's so very true, because in both, they faced a presumption of guilt. They were peppered with leading questions, a lot of intense pressuring questions and statements were made that tried to solicit confessions and also get people to name other people. So you see in the witch trials and in these investigations, all this pressure to name names.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the results of the witch trials and these Red Scare investigations were often the same, because people were branded, labeled, and they were blacklisted. In colonial times, after a witch trial, if you were tainted with an accusation, people didn't do business with you. You could hardly get anybody to trade with you so that you could get the things that you needed to live. And with the Red Scare, industries blacklisted large lists of people. There were over 300 people in the entertainment industry that got blacklisted, and nobody would hire them.
So there are fundamental features to figurative and actual witch hunts. And a great source on reading that is John Demos, his book that he published called The Enemy Within.
Yeah, which you can see behind both of us, The Enemy Within by John Demos. He goes through in there many cases of witch hunts, both literal and figurative, and finds the common features. The first common feature that he identifies is that there is some actual basis that sparks the hunt. In Salem, it's not so much a basis in actual witchcraft. It's just that the girls were actually sick and appearing to be bewitched.
They were suffering.
They were actually sick with something. At least Abigail and Betty in the beginning, in January 1692, something was going on with them. And then with the Red Scare, you do see a handful, maybe more than a handful, but there were some communist agents actually working in the US government. People like Alger Hiss were exposed. So there was some basis that there were actual communists in America and that there was a tie to helping the Soviet Union at the expense of the US. So the actual basis. So John Demos basically identified 6 common features to witch hunts. The actual basis, we talked about that. A scare, something that caused a panic. Third was this dramatically exaggerated view of the enemy. Fourth, the witch hunt proceeds in stages. It starts with identification, then goes to magnification of the enemy's characteristics and abilities, features an intense and viral investigation of the enemy, and results in social exclusion. Now, the 5th commonality is that there is elite sponsorship from religious, economic, social, or political leaders. And we see that in both the witch trials and in the case of the Red Scare. And then lastly, the 6th common feature is that there is projection of one side's undesired qualities onto others, as there is this push for purity, unity, and inner coherence. So whether you're conforming to Puritan standards or whether you're conforming to Americanism, whatever that's defined as by whoever's making the accusations.
A few Soviet agents were identified in Washington, but the threat they posed was grossly exaggerated, and the existential threat against the U.S. government was exaggerated. Likewise, in witch trials in the 17th century, here in the U.S., the threat was grossly exaggerated, and the threat was covenanting with the devil. The charges were that these individuals were working with the devil to cause harm on the community. There's no evidence that can be presented to confirm that. So we know that there were not actual witches in the Salem witch trials.
Another feature that we have of both of these panics is the power of the media. The media can both fan the flames or it can suppress the panics. You have things like in the witch trials, incendiary writings and sermons that were basically the entertainment of the day, and people preaching about how witches are around us, the devil's out around us. This fans the flames of the witch trials when the witch hunt starts. We see that also with the Red Scare with different media. Some outlets were very supportive of these investigations and anti-communism, while others were skeptical of what was going on.
You may have tuned in to CNN recently for the live streaming of the Broadway play, Good Night and Good Luck. That movie was written in 2005. It is an account of Ed Murrow, an editorial news anchor for CBS. And Ed is known for calling McCarthy out on specific accusations and procedures. In one of his news reports, Ed Murrow is quoted as saying something that I find very valuable. He said, "We can deny our heritage and our history, but we cannot escape responsibility for the result." And that is something that we all do experience, not being able to escape the responsibility of our actions.
And we know that Edward R. Murrow was right about McCarthy. McCarthy was full of it. His accusations were proven to be false. And on December 2nd, 1954, the Senate actually voted to censure McCarthy. The vote went 67 to 22. So overwhelmingly, the Senate decided that this guy was wrong and he deserved some kind of punishment. After the censure of McCarthy, his downfall, the committees that were doing these investigations kind of lost their luster, but they still continued. And Arthur Miller was actually called in to testify to the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1956. And he brought his soon-to-be bride, Marilyn Monroe, with him, so that made a big splash. Joseph R. McCarthy died on May 2nd, 1957. But as we mentioned, these investigations continued in the Congress for a while, though they never were as impactful or powerful as they were in the Red Scare.
Thank you for joining us today as we peel back many, many layers of the Crucible. Maybe you have an ancestral tie too to the Salem witch trials, or you've performed the Crucible, or maybe you have ancestral ties to the Red Scare. What is that story? Is that a story that needs to be told? We would love to hear about it, and we'd love for you to use your platform to tell those stories.
So thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Thing About Witch Hunts. As we mentioned, this is the first in a series about the Crucible, So we will get into more detail in future episodes about specific topics.
Check out our latest episodes on our new podcast, The Thing About Salem.
Good night.
And good luck.